We've looked at 3 tests of the prophet, and we'll look at the 4th one. Oh, no, excuse me. We looked at 2, and we're going to look at the other 2. Here's test number 3, according to the Bible. 1 John 4:2. Hereby know ye the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. Now, in a sense, there are 2 points here, but we're going to talk about one. If the individual that is a prophet is not talking or does not present Jesus as a real human being, in fact, the Bible says he came in sinful flesh. If they do not present it that way, they're a false prophet. But the other one, which is even more important, is that every Bible writer is Christ-centered. And that is true, has to be true of every true prophet, that they focus on Jesus. And I didn't put any quotes in because I'm sure you're familiar with Ellen White. Her book, Desire of Ages, you can't read a more inspiring book on the life of Jesus than that one. Steps to Christ. But I've decided to, most of my study has not been reading things cover to cover, but recently I decided I'm going to read the testimonies through cover to cover. And what I discover even in the testimonies is that she is pointing out somebody's sins maybe, or the institutional sins. But before you finish the chapter, she will be talking about Jesus and pointing them to his salvation and that he will forgive. And so everything she's written is Christ-centered as well. The 4th test is found in Matthew 7, verse 16, and also verse 20. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? By their fruits ye shall know them. In other words, a prophet has to live on a high level of Christianity. If they don't, then they're not a prophet. And it's their fruit of their own life that we can judge them by. Now, that leads some people to question, Jonah, what kind of a prophet was he? But the Bible clearly says that all the prophets were godly men. And just happens that Jonah was a good example of Laodicea. He had the same problem that Laodicea had. God said, tell the world the 3 angels' messages. And we went to Tarshish. We didn't take the message to the world. We've been at it 175 years and we still haven't taken it to the world. We talk about how many countries we're in, but if you think about people groups, that is, people that would only have access to the truth if we are in their people group, then the picture doesn't look so good as to how well we've covered the earth. So, I'm afraid that we're a lot like Jonah, but the good news is Jonah was turned around, and God's going to turn around the Adventist church, and we're going to do it. Just like Jonah did, we're going to do it. Now, the best way, perhaps, to illustrate her life is after her death. And I got this quote from a book called The Prophet Among You by Jemison. He used to be a teacher many, many years ago at Andrews University, and he made a textbook. And he put this quote, which is from the St. Helena newspaper. A few days after the death of Ellen White, the following article appeared in the local newspaper of the California town, St. Helena, near which she had lived for 15 years. By the death of Mrs. Ellen G. White, a noted religious leader has been called to her reward. Mrs. White was probably one of the best-known women in the world. She had traveled extensively and lectured to large audiences in many countries, and her writings had been published in various languages, carrying to people of nearly all tongues the message she felt called upon by God to deliver. Now, a lot of times we don't realize that Ellen White was not ministering only to Adventists. She was ministering to many other people in different ways, like she was a health lecturer for the Temperance Union, and they would ask her to speak. One time I was very interested in Europe. She was speaking to a large audience on the subject of health, and she announced to the audience that she was going to speak about health from the Bible. And there was a groan that went through the audience because they didn't want anything to do with the Bible. But that didn't stop her. She went right ahead and she gave a lecture from the Bible. At the end of her lecture, the people were ecstatic with happiness. They didn't realize how much was in the Bible on health. And so, she was a witness far beyond the Adventist borders. The life of Mrs. White is an example worthy of emulation by all. Though of limited education, in other words, she only went to formal school through the age of grade of 3. However, I think that people fail to tell the rest of the story. In those days, it was very acceptable to be a self-educated person. By that, we mean someone that did a lot of reading and educated themselves without going to school. Ellen White was highly educated in that way. However, she did not let that education interfere with any message that God gave her. She faithfully delivered the messages God gave her, unmixed with what she'd read in other books that was not true. Now, of course, we've faced the claim of plagiarism. First of all, in those days, there was no such thing as plagiarism, and authors actually considered it an honor if some other author would quote from them. They didn't want to prosecute them. They considered it an honor. But something very strange has been discovered, that sometimes she quotes only partly, and the quotation where the author gets off base, she changes that to be correct and uses part of the quote and corrects the quote, which shows evidence that she was sticking with what God said. If somebody was quoting, gave a quote that was in agreement with what God said, she would use it, but if it wasn't in agreement, she would either not use it or change it. So this gives actually further evidence that she was of God. It wasn't some human effort that she was using. For the greater part of her long life in poor health, she never faltered, but for 72 years carried and preached the message of Jesus Christ, as understood by her, to the furthermost corners of the earth. So, yes, she had poor health, and I think there were several reasons. She was told in her youth that if she was in danger of being lifted up, because she was very concerned, that she would make shipwreck of faith by being called to be a prophet. So she talked to the Lord about it, and he said, if you're in danger, you'll get sick, and that will keep you humble. And so some of her sicknesses were that. Some were caused by the devil because he hated what she was writing. And some were probably just normal, like all of us get sick. And she had some sickness. I think she worked pretty hard too. So when you overdo, it opens up to more potential for sickness. So she did have a lot, but sometimes she was miraculously healed so that she could give her message on a certain occasion. She was a humble, devout disciple of Christ and ever went about doing good. Her writings have been published in books, papers, and periodicals, and from her prolific pen has come writings on many religious topics. Now, you know how the newspapers like to publish the dirt. And so if there had been some real juicy bad things that Ellen White did, I'm sure they would have put that in the paper. But there weren't any. In fact, as I've become familiar with her life to quite a degree, she was not perfect. We would not consider any prophet infallible. Their writings are infallible, by the way, but they are not. And they did do wrong. But her wrong is in the category of probably what we would consider very understandable sins. For instance, I read when she was in Australia that she had people coming by her home all the time. And in those days when you give hospitality, it was a little bigger job than it is today, because you had to feed their horses while they were with you. You had to feed them. And when they left, you had to provide food for their journey till they got to the next place. So it was both an expense and a lot of work to entertain people. And they were constantly coming. And so one day she complained about having to entertain all these people. But the next day, she confessed her sin, and she said she was sorry, that she really wanted to entertain God's people whenever they came by. And so those are the kind of sins you find in her life, but no adultery, no, the grosser type of sins. She was revered by all the members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and honored and respected by all who appreciate noble womanhood consecrated to unselfish labor for the uplifting and betterment of mankind. I doubt that first line was true. In Ellen White's day, not everybody revered her, but of course many did. And today I think it's less Adventists that revere her, but still there are many who do. Her death marks the calling of another noted leader of religious thought, and one whose almost 90 years were full to overflowing with good deeds, kind words, and earnest prayers for all mankind. So that's what was published in the newspaper. And this was the final statement. This Good Samaritan will surely be greatly missed. Her reward will be commensurate with the great good she has done. I think that pretty well sums up her life. And so as we look at these four tests of a prophet, we find that she passes all four. Number one, there's nothing that she said that disagrees with the Bible. Second, there's nothing she said that was a prophecy that was supposed to already have happened, and it didn't happen. And third, she is Christ-centered. And fourth, she lived a very godly life. So, I believe, without question, that she is a true prophet and is therefore due the respect of any other of the prophets that we, of the Bible. It seems to me that some people are struggling to try to show that somehow Ellen White is in a different category from the Bible prophets. But while it is true that in the Bible are mentioned some prophets that had a true message, but they were only temporary in application, and they didn't write any books that have been left on for our use. It is true there are prophets like that, but she's not one of them. She wrote more books than any of the prophets of the Bible, and her writings are not temporary. They are to go until the end of time. And that's true of all the Bible prophets as well. So we come now to the it's called part 3, but the reason is I start with part 1, showing the prophetic truthfulness of the Bible. And in this class for you, I didn't need to do that. So I skipped that one and just started with Ellen White. This one's going to deal with the supernatural nature of her visions and dreams. Her husband gives a summary of the main points that always happened when she was taken in vision. And again, these quotations all come from the Spirit of Prophecy treasure chest from pages 20 to 25. They had a whole chapter describing the supernatural nature of her visions. Here's what James White said. Number 1, she is utterly unconscious of everything transpiring around her, as has been proved by the most rigid tests, but views herself as removed from this world and in the presence of heavenly beings. Now, when he says that they gave some rigid tests, we're going to look at some of them. But when they asked her, when she came out of vision, was she aware? No, she didn't know they were doing it. And sometimes they would call up the strongest man in the audience, and they would say, try to stop her from moving. And she would drag the person right along with her. Or try to stop her from moving. And so they would try to stop her, but they couldn't stop her. Or make her move. And they couldn't make her move when she was not moving in vision. So they had quite a few things that might seem almost sacrilegious to us to do that to the prophet. But remember, God said, you can test the prophet. I want you to know whether the prophet's genuine or not. Second one, she does not breathe. During the entire period of her continuance in vision, which has at different times ranged from 15 minutes to 3 hours, there is no breath, as has been repeatedly proved by pressing upon the chest and by closing the mouth and nostrils. So, you can't go without breathing very long, can you? This, to me, is the greatest proof of all. Satan can give people supernatural strength. So the first test by itself would not be enough. But Satan cannot resurrect people to life. So if they don't breathe and therefore die, Satan can't bring them back to life. So he would be stuck, you know. But God is able. He didn't have to bring her back to life. He kept her alive while she wasn't breathing. And only God can do that. So to me, this is powerful evidence that yes, it's supernatural, and yes, it was God's supernatural power, not the enemy. Number 3, immediately on entering vision, her muscles become rigid and joints fixed so far as any external force can influence them. At the same time, her movements and gestures, which are frequent, are free and graceful and cannot be hindered nor controlled by the strongest person. So she would become rigid as far as any other influence was concerned, unless in vision she was moving, then she could move freely. Number 4, on coming out of vision, whether in the daytime or a well-lighted room at night, all is total darkness. Her power to distinguish even the most brilliant objects held within a few inches of the eyes returns, but gradually. So, she apparently, when she's in vision, she's in a very bright light. And so when she comes out of vision, it's hard for her to see for a while. Just like if you were looking at a bright light and then you went into a dark room immediately, you would have a struggle seeing anything. She has probably had, during the past 23 years, between 1 and 200 visions. These have been given under almost every variety of circumstance, yet maintaining a wonderful similarity. So by the time her husband wrote this, she had had around 200 visions, and of course he had probably seen a lot of them. Maybe not every single one, but probably most of them. And so he outlined the 4 main characteristics of those visions. Now here's an eyewitness account. Someone that was present when she had a vision. It was Martha D. Amadon. As one who has frequently observed her in vision, knowing the company of people usually present, all deeply observant and believers in her exercises, I have often wondered why a more vivid description of the scenes which transpired has not been given. Well, if we have time, we'll read one where not everybody was a believer in her. And I doubt that always every single person was. But the visions were given to help the doubters be able to see the truth about her visions. However, probably the majority were people that did believe in her. In vision, her eyes were open. There was no breath, but there were graceful movements of the shoulders, arms, and hands, expressive of what she saw. It was impossible for anyone else to move her hands or arms, so obviously somebody had tried and couldn't do it. She often uttered words singly and sometimes sentences which expressed to those about her the nature of the view she was having, either of heaven or of earth. Her first word in vision was glory, sounding at first close by and then dying away in the distance, seemingly far away. This was sometimes repeated. So sometimes she said glory more than once, but something interesting, it was like she was being carried quite a ways away. And so the sound was fading like it would if somebody was moving away from us. And yet her body was still there. There was never an excitement among those present during a vision. Nothing caused fear. Now those are two important points. It was not a Pentecostal meeting where everybody's emotion got all stirred up and all of a sudden she goes off into thinking she had a vision. No, it wasn't like that. Neither was it from the devil, because, I've heard people describe going to one of these meetings where they were going to meet with the devil, and they said when we got into the room, the hair stood up on end on our arms, and we just felt really fearful of this place. Well, that never existed where Ellen White was receiving a vision. It was a solemn, quiet scene, sometimes lasting an hour. When the vision was ended, and she lost sight of the heavenly light, as it were, coming back to the earth once more, she would exclaim with a long-drawn sigh as she took her first natural breath, "Dark." She was then limp and strengthless. Now that didn't last too long, but at first she was just, seemingly couldn't stand up or didn't have any strength. Here's another eyewitness account from her son, Willie White. He probably saw a lot of her visions also, or saw her in vision a lot. Father and mother were carrying a heavy burden in behalf of the ministry who had been working in the state. On Sunday morning, they undertook to conduct a revival service. Father spoke for a few minutes, but with little freedom. Nowadays, most pastors don't know whether the Spirit's with them or not. But back in those days, if they started preaching and the Spirit wasn't with them, they knew it. And often they would quit preaching because the Spirit wasn't with them. Father spoke for a few minutes, but with little freedom. Then, after Mother had spoken briefly, they asked the congregation to kneel in prayer. Father offered a labored, sorrowful prayer. He was still being hindered. The Spirit wasn't really working. Now, as you'll see in a minute, it wasn't him that was the problem, but there were other things that were causing the problem. Then Mother began to implore for light and freedom. After she had prayed for about 2 minutes, she stopped. There was silence long enough to count to 40 or 50, about half a minute. I was kneeling with the congregation, and I turned to see what was the occasion for the silence. Just then she burst forth in prayer. Her voice was melodious and triumphant. See, now the Spirit is with her. And the remainder of her prayer greatly moved the people present. During that period of silence, a revelation was given her regarding the conditions in the Minnesota Conference. Also, conditions regarding the work in Battle Creek. Also, regarding other matters of general interest in the cause. So, God was showing her what was wrong in that conference because they needed to try to correct some of those things in that conference. But she was also shown things at the general conference that needed straightened out and other general things. Following the camp meeting, Father and Mother found retirement at the home of one of our brethren. Mother wrote diligently for about 2 weeks in recording what had been shown to her during the half-minute of pause in her prayer. So, you've probably heard the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Apparently, the visions that Ellen White received were generally in picture form. And so it took her a long time to write out what she saw in those pictures, in that video, you might say. She saw, and then she had to write it out. Here's another one. Sister White was in vision about 20 minutes or half an hour. As she went into vision, everyone present seemed to feel the power and presence of God. And some of us did indeed feel the Spirit of God resting upon us mightily. We were engaged in prayer and social meeting Sabbath morning at about 9 o'clock. Brother White, my father, and Sister White had prayed, and I was praying at the time. There had been no excitement, no demonstrations. We did plead earnestly with God, however, that He would bless the meeting with His presence and that He would bless the work in Michigan. As Sister White gave that triumphant shout of glory, 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 which you have heard her give so often as she goes into vision, Brother White arose and informed the audience that his wife was in vision, after stating the matter of her visions and that she did not breathe while in vision. He invited anyone who wished to do so to come forward and examine her. Dr. Drummond, a physician who was also a First-day Adventist preacher, who, before he saw her in vision, had declared her visions to be of mesmeric origin, and that he could give her a vision, imagine that, stepped forward, and after a thorough examination, turned very pale and remarked, "She doesn't breathe." So he got changed in his viewpoint. I don't know that he ever accepted her as a prophet, but he sure wasn't able to criticize her anymore. I am quite certain that she did not breathe at that time while in vision, nor in any of several others which she has had when I was present. The coming out of the vision was as marked as her going into it. The first indication we had that the vision was ended was in her again beginning to breathe. She drew her first breath deep, long, and full, in a manner showing that her lungs had been entirely empty of air. Now, some of the most powerful ones to me are the ones given by physicians, because physicians are trained to look more closely at the situation. And so here's one written by M.G. Kellogg, but he was a physician. Tells down below, M.G. Kellogg, M.D. After drawing the first breath, several minutes passed before she drew the second, which filled the lungs precisely as did the first. Then a pause of 2 minutes, and a third inhalation, after which the breathing became natural. So as she came out of vision, he described what the process was that took place. Now, F.C. Castle saw a physician check her out. A physician was present and made such examination of her as his wisdom and learning dictated, to find the cause of the manifestation. A lighted candle was held close to her eyes, which were wide open. What would happen to you if somebody did that? Yeah, you would blink. Even blink without wanting to blink. You might be trying to, but you'd have a hard time not to blink. Not a muscle of the eye moved. He then examined her in regard to her pulse, and also in regard to her breathing, and there was no respiration. Now, I wish he had included that there was pulse, but obviously there was. So her heart was beating, but there was no breathing. The result was that he was satisfied that it could not be accounted for on natural or scientific principles. Here's another testimony by D.H. Lamson. I was then 17 years old. Seems to me I can almost hear those thrilling shouts of glory which she uttered. Then she sank back to the floor, not falling, but sinking gently, and was supported in the arms of an attendant. 2 physicians came in, an old man and a young man. I should say man. Brother White was anxious that they should examine Sister White closely, which they did. A looking glass was brought, and one of them held it over her mouth while she talked. What happens if you were to do that?
Steams up.
Yeah, steams up. But there was no steam on the mirror. How can you talk without any steam coming out? But very soon they gave this up and said, she doesn't breathe. Then they closely examined her sides as she spoke to find some evidence of deep breathing, but they did not find it. As they closed this part of the examination, she arose to her feet, still in vision, holding a Bible high up, turning from passage to passage, quoting correctly, although the eyes were looking upward and away from the book. Now, it doesn't say what kind of Bible this was, but several times in her life, she held up these huge Bibles, family Bibles. One was 18 pounds. The other one, I don't know what the weight was, but that is incredible in itself. She had a view of the 7 last plagues. Then she saw the triumph of the saints and her shouts of triumph I can seem to hear even now. To these facts I freely testify. Here's another one by David Seeley. And again, he witnessed the doctor examining her. Dr. Fleming called for a lighted candle. He held this candle as near her lips as possible without burning, and in direct line with her breath in case she breathed. There was not the slightest flicker of the blaze. The doctor then said with emphasis, "That settles it forever. There is no breath in her body." Now this one clarifies about the pulse. A.W. Fowler. Dr. Lord made an examination and said, "Her heart beats, but there is no breath. There is life, but no action of the lungs. I cannot account for this condition." So he noticed both of those, or mentioned both of those. Now, of course, not everything that Ellen White received was through a vision. A vision is usually something that happens during the daytime, and it often, in her case, happened in front of people because God was trying to help the Adventist church gain confidence in her role as a prophet. But also the prophet received information through dreams. Before we look at some important facts, she has recorded the source of dreams in the Fifth Testimony, 658. There are many dreams arising from the common things of life with which the Spirit of God has nothing to do. And you've probably had some of those dreams. Sometimes people get to attaching spiritual significance to those dreams, but usually we don't. Now, God does give dreams to more than prophets, and I have heard some dreams with a spiritual interpretation I thought probably could be true. So we do have to be careful not just to condemn all dreams, but that's probably the bulk of the dreams that come just because your mind didn't shut off after you went to sleep. And they tell us that the period when you dream is just a short period before you wake up. And that's why a lot of times if you're having a bad dream, right at the worst moment of the dream, that's when you wake up. Because it happens just before you wake up anyway. There are also false dreams as well as false visions, which are inspired by the spirit of Satan. So Satan can give somebody a dream or even a vision. But dreams from the Lord are classed in the Word of God with visions, and are as truly the fruits of the spirit of prophecy as visions. Such dreams, taking into the account the persons who have them and the circumstances under which they are given, contain their own proofs of their genuineness. So this issue led her son to ask her a question. At one time, Mrs. White's son, W.C. White, made this inquiry of her: "Mother, you often speak of matters being revealed to you in the night season. You speak of dreams in which light comes to you. We all have dreams. How do you know that God is speaking to you in the dreams of which you so frequently speak?" That's a pretty valid question, isn't it? I mean, we wouldn't want to say that Ellen White never had a dream like we do. But how would she know the difference between that kind of dream and the one that was from God? Here's her answer. Because, she answered, the same angel messenger stands by my side, instructing me in the visions of the night, as stands beside me, instructing me in the visions of the day. Now, I don't know, sometimes the Bible calls it angel and it's Jesus. I don't know whether it was Jesus that always stood there while she was getting a vision or whether it was Gabriel. But there was a being that when it was a divine dream, she saw that being standing there and she knew this is from God. Now here's the miracle about the Bible. That's probably the best known one. But maybe you didn't know all the details of this story. One morning, at her own home in Portland, Maine, while in vision, Ellen Harmon stepped over to a bureau upon which rested the large volume. And this Bible weighed 18.5 pounds. Picked it up, placed it on her left hand, and then extended it at arm's length. Held the closed book with ease for half an hour. If you ever want to try that, see how long you can hold it. During the vision, in short exclamations, she referred to the value of the Word of God. Under ordinary circumstances, here's some very key points, she was unable to pick up this book, for she was in frail health and at that time weighed only 80 pounds. So she was not recovered from her childhood accident and all the things that came after that. And she was so weak that normally she couldn't even pick up the Bible with both hands. But on this occasion, she picked it up, put it on her left hand, extended her left hand, and held it for half an hour. And another key point is she was in no way fatigued by the experience. So she wasn't tired at the end. Well, that's a good stopping place. It's only a couple minutes before quitting time. But you can see, the devil can do a lot of things. He can perform miracles of healing, which look like genuine miracles of healing. He cannot genuinely heal. However, he can give somebody a disease and then he can take it away. So he can come, he can do a lot of things. But there's no way the devil could do all of these things that we read about. And so this is part of the evidence that gives us the assurance that yes, her writings are from God. What she wrote was given her by God, and we should pay attention to it. If we don't like what she has said, we should blame God, which we're probably not going to do. We're not going to blame God. We're not going to say, you gave us the wrong message, or I don't think this message is true. We're not going to do that. And yet, since we call it Ellen White's writings, which is in a sense true but not true, then some of us feel able to criticize and find fault with it. But it was from God, clearly, and we'll look at more evidence